Swiss A220-300 cockpit descends in fog at Milan Malpensa. Captain, you need to divert immediately. This approach is reckless and you're putting everyone at risk. Mr. Bauer, return to your seat. I'm landing this aircraft, and I suggest you trust me to do my job. The words hung in the cramped cockpit doorway of Swiss International Airlines, Flight LX1734, where 63-year-old Captain Elena Rossini sat with her hands steady on the controls of the Airbus A220-300. Outside the windscreen, Milan Malpensa International Airport had disappeared into a wall of fog, so thick it looked like cotton wool pressed against the glass. The visibility had dropped to less than 200 meters in the past 8 minutes. Behind her, Heinrich Bauer, a silver-haired man in an expensive wool suit, stood in the cockpit doorway, his face flushed red with anger and fear. His wife Agnes clutched his arm from the galley area, her eyes wide with worry. The runway visual range is 150 meters. First Officer Marco Weber called out from the right seat, his young voice tight with concentration. Minimums for CAT III. Captain Rossini's jaw tightened. The aircraft was at 1,200 feet, descending through the soup of fog on the instrument landing system, approach to runway 35R. Every alarm in her experienced pilot's mind told her this was going to be one of those landings. The kind you talked about for years afterward if you did everything right. The kind you never talked about at all if you didn't. I'm not moving, Bauer insisted, gripping the cockpit doorframe. I demand you divert to Zurich. My wife has a heart condition. This is insane. Daniela Conti, the senior flight attendant, appeared behind him, her professional composure cracking. Sir, federal aviation regulations require 800 feet, Marco announced. Glide slope and localizer centered. Elena turned her head slightly, her steel-gray eyes locking onto Bauer's. Sir, I have flown for 32 years. I have landed this exact aircraft in worse conditions than this. But what I cannot do safely is land with you standing in my cockpit. Daniela, remove him. Now. The tension in that moment was electric. Through the headset, Elena could hear the steady voice of Giuseppe Marini, the approach controller at Milan. Swiss 1734, winds 040 at 12 knots, runway visual range now 175 meters, cleared to land runway 35 right. Everything hung in balance. The fog, the descent, the frightened passenger blocking her cockpit, and somewhere below, invisible in the murk, a concrete runway that had to be there, had to be exactly where the instruments said it was. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Captain Elena Rossini walked through the early morning darkness toward her aircraft at Zurich Airport. The date was October 10th, 2025, and the autumn chill had settled over Switzerland with the promise of winter not far behind. Elena carried her flight case with the same purposeful stride she'd maintained for 3 decades of flying. At 63 years old, she was one of the most senior captains at Swiss International Airlines, and today's flight to Milan, a short 45-minute hop across the Alps, should have been routine. The Airbus A220-300 sat on the apron, its sleek fuselage gleaming under the airport lights. Elena loved this aircraft. It was modern, efficient, and beautifully designed. She'd been flying the A220 since Swiss had taken delivery of the Type 4 years earlier, and she knew every system, every quirk, every sound it made. "Good morning, Captain," Marco Weber called out as he approached from the crew bus. At 31, Marco was young enough to be her son, but Elena had specifically requested him as her first officer for this month's rotation. He was sharp, methodical, and most importantly, he listened. "Morning, Marco," Elena replied with a slight smile. "Ready for some Italian coffee?" "Always," he grinned. "Weather's looking interesting, though. Milan's reporting fog moving in." Elena glanced at her tablet, pulling up the latest METAR, the Meteorological Aerodrome report for Milan Malpensa. "Visibility down to 800 meters and dropping. We'll keep an eye on it." They entered the aircraft through the forward door, where Daniela Conti was already conducting her pre-flight briefing with the 2 junior flight attendants. Daniela, 58, had flown with Elena dozens of times over the years. They'd developed the kind of professional rapport that came from mutual respect and countless flights together. "Captain Rossini," Daniela greeted her warmly. "Full load today. 72 passengers, including 1 wheelchair assistant and a family with 3 small children. Any special concerns? Elena asked, setting her flight case down in the cockpit. Mr. and Mrs. Bauer in seats 2A and 2B, Daniela said, lowering her voice slightly. They've already asked about the weather 3 times. He's quite assertive. Elena nodded. She dealt with anxious passengers for 32 years. If they have concerns, send them to me before departure. Better to address it on the ground. The cockpit of the A220-300 was a marvel of modern aviation technology. 5 large LCD screens dominated the instrument panel, 2 primary flight displays, 2 navigation displays, and a center engine and systems display. Elena settled into the left seat, the captain's seat, and began her flows. Oxygen, she said, checking the pressure gauge. Checked, Marco responded from the right seat, working through his own checklist. Circuit breakers. Checked. Flight controls. Elena moved the sidestick controller through its full range of motion, watching the ailerons, elevator, and rudder respond on the synoptic display. Everything was smooth, precise, mechanical perfection. Outside, the ramp crew was loading the last of the baggage. The A220 could carry up to 12 tons of cargo, though today's load was light, mostly business travelers heading to Milan for meetings, along with a handful of tourists. The morning proceeded normally. Passengers boarded in that controlled chaos that Elena had witnessed thousands of times, businessmen checking their phones, families organizing children, flight attendants smiling and directing people to seats. Then Heinrich and Agnes Bauer appeared at the cockpit door. Heinrich was perhaps 70 years old, with perfectly groomed silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge. His wife Agnes, a few years younger, wore elegant clothes and an expression of nervous concern. Captain, Heinrich said without preamble, my wife and I would like to discuss the weather situation in Milan. Elena turned in her seat, her expression professional and calm. Good morning, Mr. Bauer. I'm Captain Rossini. What concerns do you have? Fog, he said bluntly. I've been checking the weather on my phone. Milan is going below minimums. I believe you should divert us to Rome or return to Zurich. Elena noted the iPad in his hand, open to an aviation weather app. He'd done his homework, at least superficially. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Bauer, she said evenly. The current forecast shows the fog moving through Milan, but conditions should be above our landing minimums for the next several hours. We're monitoring it closely. If conditions deteriorate below safety limits, we'll divert to our alternate, which is Bergamo. But you'll still attempt a landing first, Heinrich pressed. My wife has a heart condition. The stress of a difficult landing could be dangerous for her. Agnes touched her husband's arm gently. Heinrich, please, the captain knows what she's doing. Elena looked at Agnes, seeing the genuine worry there, and softened her tone. Mrs. Bauer, I understand completely. I've been flying for 32 years, and I promise you I will not attempt any landing that I don't consider safe. Your well-being is my first priority. If I have any doubt at all, we divert. You have my word. Heinrich didn't look satisfied, but Agnes nodded gratefully. Thank you, Captain. After they returned to their seats, Marco glanced at Elena. That's going to be fun if the weather does get worse. We'll be fine, Elena said, but she made a mental note of the Bauers. Anxious passengers who thought they understood aviation could be problematic, especially during irregular operations. The departure from Zurich was textbook perfect. At precisely 7:15 local time, Swiss LX 1734 pushed back from gate B47. The Pratt & Whitney PW1500G engines spooled up with their characteristic smooth whine, and the aircraft taxied toward runway 14. Swiss 1734, cleared for takeoff runway 14, wind 160 at 8 knots, the tower controller transmitted. Cleared for takeoff 14, Swiss 1734, Marco acknowledged. Elena advanced the thrust levers. The A220 accelerated down the runway, the Alps visible in the distance under a clear morning sky. At 134 knots, Marco called rotate, and Elena pulled back smoothly on the side stick. The aircraft lifted off into the autumn morning. Positive rate, Marco announced. Gear up! The landing gear retracted with a solid thunk, and they climbed out over the Swiss countryside, turning south toward the Alps and Italy beyond. For the first 30 minutes, everything was perfect. They leveled at flight level 28,000 feet and cruised smoothly above the mountain peaks. The passengers had their morning coffee, the flight attendants moved through the cabin, and the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky. Then the first update came from Milan approach. Swiss 1734, Milan Control. Be advised the field is now reporting visibility 500 meters in fog, runway visual range varying between 300 and 700 meters. Current conditions below your company minimums. Advise intentions. Elena and Marco exchanged glances. They were still 30 minutes from Milan. Milan Control, Swiss 1734, request latest weather trend and forecast, Elena transmitted. Swiss 1734, trend is stable to improving. Forecast shows fog lifting by 0930 local time. Your estimated arrival is 0855. Elena did the mental math. They'd arrive before the fog was forecast to lift, but potentially after it had started improving. Marco, pull up Bergamo as alternate. Marco's fingers moved across the center display, programming Bergamo Airport Orio al Serio into the flight management computer. It was 40 kilometers from Milan, outside the fog bank. Called Captain Thomas Weber, one of her longtime colleagues. Heard you had quite an approach. Everything okay? Just another day in paradise, Elena replied with a grin. Though I could use a strong espresso. But even as she settled into the lounge with her coffee, Elena's mind was already on the return flight to Zurich that afternoon. The fog had lifted completely now, but weather was always changing, always presenting new challenges. That was what she loved about flying. Every day was different, every approach unique, every landing a small victory against the forces of weather, physics, and chance. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter in Zurich. Saw the weather reports for Milan. Everything okay, Mom? Elena smiled and typed back. Perfect landing. Home tonight. Love you. She thought about Heinrich and Agnes Bauer, about their fear and his fierce protectiveness of his wife. She thought about Marco's steady voice calling out altitudes through the chaos, about Daniella's professionalism in handling a difficult passenger situation. This was why she still flew at 63, when many of her contemporaries had retired. Not for the routine trips, though those paid the bills, but for the moments that tested you, that reminded you why you'd fallen in love with aviation in the first place. At precisely 1400 hours, Elena and Marco walked back to their aircraft for the return flight to Zurich. The A220-300 had been serviced, refueled, and was ready for another journey. The passenger load was lighter for the return, only 43 passengers, mostly business travelers heading back to Switzerland. Elena conducted her walk-around inspection in the bright afternoon sunshine, the morning's fog now nothing but a memory. Captain Rossini. Elena turned to see a young woman in a Swiss Airlines ground crew uniform. Yes, I'm Sarah Hoffman. I'm training to become a pilot. I heard about your landing this morning and I just wanted to say, that's exactly the kind of pilot I want to be someday. Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest. What stage of training are you in? I just got my private license. I'm saving money to start my commercial training. That's wonderful, Elena said genuinely. Keep at it. Aviation needs more women pilots. And remember the technical skills, the knowledge, all of that is important. But what really matters is judgment. The ability to make the right decision under pressure, to stay calm when everything around you is chaos. That's what separates good pilots from great ones. Will you tell me about the landing? Sarah asked, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Elena glanced at her watch. They had 15 minutes before boarding. Walk with me. As they moved around the aircraft, Elena described the approach, the deteriorating weather, the passenger conflict, the split-second decision-making required. She explained how the aircraft systems worked, how the CAT III approach functioned, why procedures existed. The most important thing, Elena concluded, is that I never doubted the aircraft or my training. I knew the systems, I knew my minimums, I knew what the A220 could do. That confidence built on knowledge and experience is what allowed me to handle the situation, both the technical challenge and the human one. The passenger in the cockpit, Sarah said. That must have been terrifying. It was concerning, Elena admitted. But you know what I've learned? Most people who seem difficult are really just frightened. This gentleman was terrified for his wife. Once I understood that, I could address his real concern, not his anger. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I hope I can be that calm someday. You will be, Elena assured her. Because you'll train, you'll practice, and you'll learn. and each flight will teach you something new. Even after 32 years, I'm still learning. The return flight to Zurich was, indeed, routine. Clear skies, light winds, a smooth ride over the Alps. Elena let Marco fly the leg, coaching him through the approach into Zurich as the sun began to set behind the mountains. "Beautiful evening," Marco observed as they taxied to the gate. "Yes," Elena agreed. "They all are when you really look." After shutdown, as they gathered their bags, Marco said, "Captain, thank you for today. For staying calm, for teaching me, for showing me what real command looks like. Marco, you were excellent up there. Your callouts were perfect. You stayed focused despite the chaos." "That's exactly what I needed. We're a crew, remember? We succeed together." They parted ways in the terminal. Elena drove home to her apartment in Zurich, arriving just as the last light faded from the sky. Her cat, Ginger, meowed a greeting, and Elena scratched behind her ears while checking her email. There was a message from Swiss Airlines chief pilot, Captain Andreas Müller. "Elena, received a commendation today from passenger Heinrich Bauer regarding LX 1734. He praised your professionalism, your skill, and your patience in dealing with his interference during approach. He specifically noted that you treated him with dignity even when he was out of line. Well done. This is exactly the kind of pilot we want representing Swiss." Andreas, Elena smiled and closed her laptop. She poured herself a glass of wine and stood by her apartment window, looking out at the lights of Zurich. She thought about all the flights she'd commanded over 3 decades. The thunderstorms over the Atlantic, the engine failure departing Los Angeles, the medical emergency at 37,000 feet. Each one had tested her in different ways. Each one had taught her something. But today's flight, LX 1734, Zurich to Milan and back, would stay with her. Not because of the technical challenge of the CAT III approach, though that was significant, but because of Heinrich Bauer, a frightened man who'd acted badly out of love for his wife. And because of the moment when she'd helped him see that trust, not panic, was the answer to fear. The next morning, Elena received another email, this one from Heinrich Bauer himself. "Dear Captain Rossini, Agnes and I wanted to reach out personally to thank you again for yesterday. After much discussion, and at Agnes's insistence, I've made an appointment with my doctor to discuss anxiety management. Agnes has also spoken with her cardiologist about travel concerns." "You were right. My panic was worse for her heart than any turbulence or fog could be. We've also had a long conversation about trust and control. Agnes reminded me that I can't protect her from everything, and trying to do so actually causes more harm. Your words about the decades of safety development in aviation really resonated with me. I'm an engineer by background, and I understand systems and redundancy. I should have trusted those systems, and I should have trusted you. Thank you for your patience, your skill, and your wisdom. If we're ever fortunate enough to fly with you again, I promise to be the passenger you deserve. With deepest gratitude, Heinrich and Agnes Bauer." Elena read the email twice, then forwarded it to Daniela with a note. "Sometimes we really do make a difference. Thank you for your help yesterday." That afternoon, she had a meeting at Swiss Airlines headquarters with the training department. They wanted to discuss incorporating her CAT III approach into training scenarios, specifically, the aspect of dealing with passenger interference during critical phases of flight. "It's something we don't practice enough," said Captain Müller, the chief pilot. "The human factors, the ability to maintain command presence while also showing empathy. How you handled Mr. Bauer, that's not something we can easily teach in a simulator." "No," Elena agreed, "but we can talk about it. We can share experiences. We can remind crews that passengers who seem difficult are usually just frightened." "Would you be willing to speak at our next CRM seminar?" Müller asked. CRM, Crew Resource Management, was the training that focused on communication, decision-making, and human factors in aviation. "I'd be honored," Elena said. Over the following weeks, the story of Flight LX 1734 became something of a legend within Swiss Airlines. Not because of any dramatic emergency or near disaster, but because it represented something deeper about what it meant to be a pilot. Elena continued her normal flying schedule: Milan, Paris, London, Frankfurt, the short European routes that made up the bulk of Swiss's operations. Each flight was different, each presented its own small challenges. But every time she passed through Milan Malpensa, she thought of that foggy morning, of the wall of white outside her windscreen. of Heinrich Bauer's frightened face, of the moment when the runway lights finally appeared through the murk. 3 months later, Elena was preparing for a flight to Paris when she received a message from a passenger. Heinrich and Agnes Bauer were booked on her flight. When they boarded, Heinrich approached the cockpit with a smile. "Captain Rossini, we specifically requested this flight when we saw you were commanding. Agnes has a checkup with a cardiac specialist in Paris, and we both agreed there's no pilot we'd rather fly with." Agnes appeared beside him, looking healthy and cheerful. "Heinrich has been much better about flying, and I've been cleared by 3 separate doctors for travel. But we wanted you to know that morning in Milan, you did more than just land a plane safely. You helped us both in ways we're still discovering." Elena stood and shook both their hands. "I'm delighted to have you aboard. Today's forecast is clear skies all the way to Paris. But if anything comes up, I promise you'll be the first to know." "We trust you completely," Heinrich said simply. And in that moment, Elena understood something profound about her profession. Yes, pilots were responsible for safely operating complex machinery through 3-dimensional space. Yes, they needed technical knowledge, judgment, and skill. But more than that, they were guardians of something precious: the trust that passengers placed in them every time they stepped aboard an aircraft. That trust was earned through competence, certainly, but also through empathy, communication, and the wisdom to see beyond surface behaviors to the fears and hopes underneath. The flight to Paris was textbook perfect: smooth takeoff, calm cruise, gentle landing. When they disembarked, Heinrich and Agnes thanked Elena again, and she watched them walk hand in hand into Charles de Gaulle Airport. "Another satisfied customer," Marco observed. He'd been assigned to fly with Elena again this month. "The best kind," Elena replied. "The kind who trusted us to do our jobs." That evening, as Elena walked through the Zurich airport terminal toward her car, she passed a group of young pilot cadets in their crisp uniforms, probably just finishing their ground school. They looked so young, so eager, so full of dreams about flying. She remembered being their age, remembered her first solo flight, her first command, her first bad weather approach. She remembered all the lessons she'd learned, all the mistakes she'd made, all the moments of doubt and triumph. And she thought about Heinrich Bauer's email, about Sarah Hoffman wanting to become a pilot, about Marco's steady voice calling out altitudes through the fog. This was the real story of aviation, not the dramatic emergencies or the technical triumphs, though those had their place. The real story was about people, people trusting each other, people learning from each other, people taking care of each other at 35,000 feet, or in the fog at 50 feet, or anywhere in between. Elena reached her car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Her phone showed a new text from her daughter. "When are you retiring, Mom? You've been flying forever." Elena smiled and typed back, "Not yet, sweetheart. Still have a few more stories left to tell." Because that's what each flight was, really a story. Some were short and simple, others long and complex. Some were routine, others extraordinary, but each one mattered. Each one was a small piece of the larger story of human flight, of our ability to soar above the earth, to connect continents, to bring people together. Elena Rossini had been flying for 32 years, and she'd commanded thousands of flights. She'd landed in storms and sunshine, in fog and wind, in routine conditions and extraordinary circumstances. She'd carried businessmen and families, tourists and locals, nervous flyers and aviation enthusiasts. And every single one of them, all those tens of thousands of passengers, had placed their trust in her. That was the real weight of command, heavier than any aircraft, more complex than any system. The trust of people who believed you would keep them safe, who believed you would make the right decisions, who believed you knew what you were doing even when the fog was so thick you couldn't see 50 meters ahead. It was a weight she carried proudly, would carry until the day she finally hung up her wings. And even then, she hoped, the lessons would continue passed on to pilots like Sarah Hoffman, like Marco Weber, like all the young aviators who would come after. The fog would always return. Weather would always be a challenge. Passengers would always bring their fears and hopes aboard. But as long as pilots like Elena kept flying, kept learning, kept remembering that aviation was ultimately about people taking care of each other, the skies would remain safe. She started her car and drove home through the Zurich evening, the lights of the airport fading behind her. Tomorrow she'd fly again, Another flight, another story, another chance to do what she loved. And somewhere in Milan, Heinrich and Agnes Bauer were probably having dinner, holding hands, grateful for the gift of trust that Elena had helped them rediscover. Not just trust in aviation, but trust in each other, trust in themselves, trust in the simple fact that sometimes the best thing you can do is let go of control and believe in the competence of others. That, Elena thought as she pulled into her parking space, was the real lesson of Flight LX1734. Not the technical aspects of a CAT III approach, not the procedures for handling difficult passengers, but the fundamental truth that fear dissolves in the presence of competence, compassion, and confidence. She locked her car and walked to her apartment, where Ginger would be waiting for her dinner, and where Elena would pour herself a glass of wine and perhaps read a book before bed. Tomorrow was another day, another flight, another story. And Elena Rossini, captain of Swiss International Airlines, couldn't wait to see what it would bring. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.